Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Collateral Global podcast, where we explore the legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic on science, society, and public health policy. And I'm delighted to have my guest, Geoff Shullenberger, with us today, who's a cultural theorist, an editor at Compact Magazine, and a previous professor at NYU in New York City. And Geoff has covered the COVID-19 debate in America since the beginning, I would say, for quite a while, in different outlets like Unheard and Tablet. And he's the editor alongside Elena Lange of a recent book, which we'll be talking about today, COVID-19 and the Left, the Tyranny of Fear. So it's great to have you on the podcast, Geoff.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, okay, let's jump in here. A book on COVID and the left. Why did you decide on this? What motivated you?
Well, I should first give credit to my co-editor, Elena, who really had the idea first. And I'd say, roughly, and the reason I was brought into the project was that, both of us came out of a sort of set of left-wing academic traditions and intellectual traditions, broadly on the kind of Marxist and, it's often a word of sort of right-wing criticism today, but critical theory, the world of critical theory, the world of cultural theory, as you said before. And so I think, both of us, as well as other people who contributed to the volume, were struck by the way that much of the left and the intellectual and academic left became extremely doctrinaire in supporting and promoting this sort of policies that were adopted in 2020, and which are the focus of your organization's kind of critique and which I think I'm sure share many of the same broad criticisms of. So the thing that animated this project, which I think most of the contributors were people who had some degree of background in the kind of Marxist academic left. Not all of them, but the majority of them were kind of similarly, interested in and distressed by this phenomenon. And so it was something that I had written about, a good amount prior to getting involved in the book. Even I wrote a pretty widely discussed piece, and to be clear, Michel Foucault was kind of an anti-Marxist, was not a Marxist, but he had been a member of the Communist Party in his youth, but he was actually very critical of Marxism, but very much a figure of the academic left and of the sort of broad world of critical theory. And I wrote a piece about his immensely influential work in terms of its impact within sort of Anglophone academia and among sort of left-wing academics, and the way that seemingly much of what he argued had been forgotten, because a great deal of his work was a sort of quite systematic critique of expertise, of experts, right, of public health, of medical power, of the various institutions that were involved in bringing about the politics of COVID as we knew it. And so that was, I'd say, my first kind of big salvo into the subject matter was this piece, which I believe came out in late 2021, and it got a good amount of attention and discussion and so that was, I think, the first big. I mean, I'd written other things that touched on this, but it was the first big thing I wrote that really laid out this set of concerns and interests. And so that was kind of where it came from. And let me just say one other thing without wanting to, go too much off on my own tangents. But, the thing that was striking from the very beginning was that one of the first voices of dissent from lockdown policy, when it was first rolled out in the first country in the West to enact it, which was Italy, was Giorgio Agamben, who was, when I was, a graduate student, was sort of the hero of the anti-war on terror left. I mean, he was a figure who was who really kind of set the terms of the discussion, at least within certain precincts of academia, about what was going on with the war on terror, what was going on with the post 9/11 era. And so he was very much a figure who, was a massive presence in the discussions of that period. And so then seeing him come out, already in February, sort of issuing criticisms of this state of, and this notion of the state of exception or state of emergency had been a topic of much of his writing. So issuing criticisms that, I think based on his prior work, you could expect, but then that immediately led to a backlash from many of his colleagues who, really even before lockdowns had really been rolled out or fully accepted, were already very concerned about the position he was taking.
Yeah.
In this moment. And so, I think that meant that, in a way, from the very beginning, this question of like the role of the academic and sort of intellectual left in the course that the pandemic took was central from the very beginning, just because of Agamben's
Right.
quite significant presence as an early critic. So,
And yet, I mean, most people attacked him, and he wasn't exactly welcomed, right, with his perspective. I think I've come across this so many times over the last couple of years of people being very perplexed by the left's response. And there's lots of different essays and ideas thrown around here. Do you have any sort of nuggets of hidden wisdom or insights on trying to explain the general sort of leftist response to the pandemic that you can share with us?
So really, it's hard to summarize. In a sense, the book is a whole collection of different attempts to answer this question from different angles. And so, I'd say one thing that I focus in on the essay that I wrote there for the volume is so one thing that struck me was this rhetoric surrounding that you heard from people, including Slavoj Žižek, who's another notable kind of leftist who I generally admire and have learned a lot from. But he was one of the figures who after having previously been a kind of colleague and ally of Agamben's on many things, did criticize him quite early on. And he, among other people, used this rhetoric of the real. So in other words, like what COVID represented to them, to this particular strand of intellectuals, was some kind of forceful assertion of the real that was had just kind of crashed into society. And and sort of the argument was that people who were falling back on, concerns about, civil liberties or, authoritarianism or things like that, were somehow kind of refusing to face the real, right? That this real was something that we had to confront. And so what I focus on in my piece is the ambiguity of this notion of the real, because what we were actually the way that we were apprehending this real was for the most part through things like graphs, charts, models, essentially simulations, right? So there's an odd, how are we trying to apprise ourselves of reality in the sort of early pandemic era? Well, basically people were looking at like lines going up on a screen. And so, what I find kind of interesting there is this ambiguity where the thing that you present as being just this overwhelming reality that just crashes through all of your illusions is actually something you apprehend, indirectly in the form of simulations, essentially, right? For the most part, right? Because the point, it's like obviously people got the virus, but the virus, the reality of the virus in the way that these people wanted to present it was something more than just the individual experience of getting sick. It was something that had these kind of society-wide ramifications. And so I was interested in, the role of modeling simulation and the way that, this question of the real was always almost always apprehended indirectly through these kind of technologies and representations. And so, this is my nugget, which I will, try to answer your question with, which is that I think, one obvious reason that this was, that the left was prepared for this and was kind of able to take up this position was that this more or less and explicitly in some cases was already the way that climate change was thought about, right? The way that the issue of climate was thought about, which is that, it's the real, it's something that is, crashing through our comfortable illusions. And yet it's also strangely elusive, right? The way that we apprehend it again is because, of course, it can never be reduced to, the individual experience of like weather events. The way we apprehend it is through these charts of, average temperature rise and things like that. And so, I think there's this interesting form of politics that had already sort of taken root where, there's an attraction to the idea of emergency as the opportunity for some kind of radical change. And then, but then if you think about how the politics of that work, it's sort of inherently technocratic because it's reliant on the experts who know how to, create graphs and charts and who know how to, map out things in these sort of abstract forms. And so it seems to me that for various, I think, sociological reasons that we could also get into, this kind of this emergency politics was something that already, particularly around environments and climate, had been kind of instilled in much of the left as, this is on one hand a disaster, but it's also kind of seen as an opportunity, right? It's like once this real crashes through, you have to just tear up everything and start again, which is, this kind of utopian year zero possibility moment, which is really how a lot of people understood this early COVID moment. But then the way the politics of it are framed kind of through this particular way of seeing, right, which is through graphs and charts and so on, is very much tied to, necessarily tied to a kind of naturalization of expertise as the form of political subjectivity, right? That the political subject who is going to bring about this transformation has to be in some way plugged into these kind of abstract forms of representation, which are what enable us to get a grasp on this actually quite elusive reality.
So I mean, on the one hand, I'm hearing this tale of a single narrative, right? There's this sort of uniformity. Of course, when you're talking about the left, like I think one thing that was quite striking about COVID was just the degree to which there was a similarity globally, right? In terms of experience, but also often in terms of the way that different political forces responded. So when you're saying the left in COVID, are you referring to America? Are you referring to America and Western Europe? Like, and what's your sense of difference between the responses on the left in different countries? Or do you feel like actually there's quite a uniform response across the globe and we can generalize and say the left? Or who are you referring to exactly here?
Yeah, I would say I'm referring to the kind of Western, intellectual left primarily. I think, I don't have a granular enough understanding of how it played out in other parts of the world to be able to give a detailed account of that. I do have some sort of interesting counterexamples. One that is somewhat striking is Mexico, where you had a left-wing president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, who, was kind of, he didn't get quite as much attention as, someone like Bolsonaro in Brazil, which, sort of kept in play the idea that sort of COVID skepticism, or COVID policy skepticism was a sort of right-wing phenomenon. But AMLO was also a kind of skeptic of lockdowns. He was a skeptic of masks, mask mandates, etc. So he was a very successful and popular left-wing leader, and very much in a kind of populist vein, who was relatively resistant to these policies. Now, because he didn't really have as I understand it, policy was largely determined on the state level in Mexico, just because of how public health is managed there, not dissimilarly to the U.S. That there was a wide array of responses, and some leaders, some governors and state level politicians within his party, I think, were more sort of hawkish, but he was a notable figure of a sort of left-wing head of state who was quite on the skeptical side. So that, and one thing I would say there is that Mexico is a country where the left has still has a large working class base. It's definitely not the party of the intellectual elites. Interestingly, in fact, a lot of the intellectual elites of Mexico really dislike AMLO. So it's not a country that's undergone this kind of de-alignment of the left from the broad base of the working class. And so it's, sociologically, just the left is a different phenomenon. AMLO's base of support is a different phenomenon than left groups in North America and Europe, which are largely dominated by sort of professional managerial class. And this is a major focus of the book, right? That the social base of the left in much of the sort of global north is the professional managerial class, and so you can't really understand it without thinking of it that way. Another example that Toby Green, who I think is involved with Collateral Global, has written about some, I believe, is Nicaragua, which is not a government I necessarily admire or want to say. I mean, I generally do have pretty good things to say about Mexico, about AMLO in Mexico, but I wouldn't want to speak too fondly of Ortega's government in Nicaragua. But nevertheless, they did pursue a more dovish approach on COVID, and they are one of the few governments that is still descended from these kind of Latin American leftist kind of national liberation movements of the 60s and 70s. And so that was another example. Another one that Toby has written about is Tanzania. Was somewhat interesting, which again, I don't know a huge amount about, but I believe that was another case of a kind of global South government that was left aligned and did kind of buck the pressure from various kind of global organizations to pursue the same suite of lockdown and mandate policies.
Or Sweden is an obvious one, right? Which is a social.
Right, of course, yes, yeah.
Very, very strange moments when you have Sweden and Governor DeSantis in Florida agreeing on like pretty major emergency policy, right? That was an interesting time. And then the New York Times and other outfits criticizing them and somehow comparing them as if they're the same political bloc, which is really curious. How have you seen over time? Have you seen the left, the mainstream intellectual elite of the left, kind of come to terms maybe with what took place and sort of the politics of authoritarianism that came out, and the sort of excesses that people were led to? Or how do you see that sort of memorization and reckoning over time, or has it just been all put under the carpet from your standpoint? What do you think?
So at least in the US, left organizations, sort of socialist organizations and so on, are really some of the last holdouts of extreme COVID kind of dead-ender politics. They still have mandates, they still have like if you go to their events, there's and conferences, they're still masked. I mean, it's really quite striking. And there's a good piece by Ben Burgess in Damage magazine about that was actually about Naomi Klein's book about Naomi Wolf, but it talks about how, Klein, in kind of presenting Woolf as this extremist outlier and kind of bizarre figure, which she is, nevertheless also, pointed to the way that if you look at the sort of socialist left in the US, it is really, it's quite bizarre, the degree of its, and I think it really has to do with this kind of culture of deference to the, people who present themselves as vulnerable, so that you have like basically these sort of caucuses of like people who, claim to have long COVID or other things. And they, because the culture is one of kind of deference to whoever is able to present themselves as the most oppressed, then the whole organization, basically accedes to those demands, because there's no way within such a culture to avoid doing so, really. And so, I think within that version of the left, it's still a very live thing, and it's part of why, there's no conceivable way I could ever have anything to do with these organizations.
Yeah.
And, I think more broadly, it's like, it's a mixed bag. I mean, I think there's been something of a walking back, or a kind of, some degree or some possibility of like more skeptical reflections. But I think for the most part, people who aren't, people who aren't sort of deeply involved in kind of activism would who again, who are largely, still very much keeping the faith of COVID stuff, even when everybody else has given it up. There's very little interest in the subject. Like, people just would prefer to move on and not think about it, is my sense. And so that's pretty concerning as well, just because it means that there's not really an interest in, learning any lessons or trying to figure out what actually happened.
Right.
So
then in that regard, COVID didn't really represent a big rupture. Going back to your sort of earlier point about the climate of sort of fear and states of emergency sort of narrative pre-COVID, priming the left for this state of exception or rebirth, let's say, or opportunity to reshape this utopian vision. And then sort of when it didn't happen, I guess, how do people sort of square that like original sense of this being this huge rupture with then the fact that, well, actually not much has really changed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think on one level it's kind of a piece with a lot of things that have happened on the political left. I mean, I would turn people to an essay that I edited that we published in Compact Magazine called "How COVID Killed Utopia." That gives an interest. It's by Ari Gansman and Jose Lopez, and it's they're both or one is an anthropologist, the other is a sociologist, and they're kind of situating COVID within the history of kind of human rights as an animating focus and cause for the left, which goes back several decades. Part of their inspiration is Samuel Moyn's book, The Last Utopia, which sort of argues and charts the way that the left in the 70s, when the kind of dreams of revolution were being sort of postponed or given up on, they became animated by various kinds of human rights causes, right, and human rights activism. And so, I think on one level you could see, and so they argue that, the way that COVID was framed as a kind of cause on the left was, owed a lot sort of in its moral impetus and sort of conceptual framing to this history of kind of human rights. Even though ironically, of course, the implementation of these policies often involved grave violations of human rights, but and led to grave violations of human rights. But nonetheless, it's an interesting piece. But yeah, I mean, I think the reason I bring it up is, yes, there was kind of an idea that this was somehow an opportunity for some kind of rupture, right? Partly because it was like this sort of somewhat strange notion that, sort of capitalism had been put on hold, and that, it had been put on hold in order to like care for people, or
Right.
that something had been, like, the idea on the left was that like something had been prioritized above profits, and this
Okay.
meant that some kind of brighter hope for humanity was coming out of this moment. And I mean, there are various things I could say that are critical about that, but I think the reason that piece, How COVID Killed Utopia, is useful is because it situates it in this kind of longer history of like the postponement of utopia, or the transformation of this kind of utopian horizon into or the sort of the channeling of utopian hopes into new causes, and the way that, of course, these are repeatedly disappointed. I mean, I think what part of what's striking is that there's a kind of, and I think this is true of all politics to some extent, right? There's a kind of ambulance chasing like aspect
Right.
to all politics today, where there's a real kind of opportunism, and just a real lack of kind of, and so the human rights sensibility sort of encourages that, because it means, okay, there's some crisis somewhere in the world, so you have to like suspend everything else to
Right.
deal with
Yeah.
that. I think that is, I don't want to get sidelined into this, but like that's sort of part of how I'd be critical of like the Gaza, the politics of Gaza, because it again is this kind of humanitarian or human rights framing that sort of suspends certain like quite fundamental political questions. And so I think that that kind of framing, where something becomes a human rights emergency,
Right.
that you then sort of suspend fundamental political questions to supposedly address. But in doing that, and then this can be seen as somehow utopian, right? Because you're sort of giving up business as usual so as to to care for the vulnerable, but at the same time, you're also you're again suspending very fundamental questions through taking on this kind of emergency politics sensibility.
Well, one thing that we haven't talked about is how that suspension takes place, and in the emotional atmosphere that's created. So the subtitle of your book is The Tyranny of Fear, right? And in it, you make the case that fear, panic, and you actually use the term in the abstract, psychological blackmail, right? Are these tools for domination? And you sort of ask, okay, is the left a sort of a victim of fear and panic and psychological blackmail, or are they actually the perpetrators of it, right? Causing it in throughout society, and perhaps self-inflicting it on their own constituents. Tell us a little bit. How do you think that fear and the tyranny of fear sort of plays into this?
Yeah, I find this continually perplexing question as I look back on it. Sort of, clearly there's an element of just, this interesting way that sort of informational virality connects to the virality of the actual virus in the COVID era, where, there's a way that, the contagion of certain affects, or of both certain ideas, certain, memes. And, there are various weird things that happened in that period that I think relate to fear, that have still never really been fully explained, right? Like, these videos of people like dropping dead on the street in China, right? These were a major vector of fear. It's not entirely clear where they came from, what their purpose was. They are clear, it's weird that they continued to be, there was never really because, very soon people knew that this was not a disease that caused people to just like keel over and die on the street.
Right.
And nonetheless, they were efficacious at kind of creating a mood.
Yeah.
And so, it's very hard for me to say, okay, where did that come? Was this Chinese Communist Party propaganda of some sort? Was it not? Was it more? Because of course the Chinese Communist Party initially tried to kind of downplay this before reversing course. And so, I think there's a very interesting question of, top down versus kind of bottom up versus sort of horizontal spread of these kind of contagious sentiments, including fear. And it's often quite hard to determine, right? Like it's notable that, of course, this begins in an authoritarian country where there is a clear kind of effort to impose a kind of top-down information flow, although, with a certain kind of managed social media sphere allowed to operate. And so it is notable that, of course, this begins in a country where there is a strong element of just state, straight up traditional state propaganda that's operating. But then, that's when that's carried over into the world as a whole, I think some very strange things happen. And, it's worth noting that in the initial phase of, COVID spread kind of in like January, February 2020, I would say it was actually like more right-wing accounts that were spreading the most, like the most pessimistic or kind of apocalyptic narratives. And so that was, I'm sure I imagine most people are aware of this reversal, but it was quite striking, right? It was like, if you followed these kind of anonymous right-wing accounts on Twitter, a lot of them were, talking in very kind of gloom and doom terms. They were encouraging, kind of stockpiling of resources, telling you where to get N95 masks, things like that. And so, and it was kind of framed in this like prepper sort of, kind of survivalist mode. Like we're going to be entering Mad Max territory before long. And then if you looked at the mainstream news, it was if you looked at outlets like the New York Times or Washington Post, let's say, they were pretty like, don't freak out. So they're actually trying to discourage fear, right? And so then like certain things happened that, again, I think are a bit hard to figure out, right? Like in terms of, I don't know. I still, being in New York City, I actually spent the early part of the pandemic away from New York City. But, the sort of large scale death event that ostensibly happened here was another major moment, as was, what happened in northern Italy. Yeah. And that, where here you had this kind of, you had this environment of fear that was created, and then images that were circulated, showing this sense that, there really was this like absolutely devastating plague that was just going to, take out a large portion of the population, right? That was really and people people who I know who were still here at the time were like saying, yeah, if you walked by a hospital, there were like overflow morgues, like in sort of trailers on the street outside and stuff like that. Now, what's kind of strange is that that fact wasn't really replicated in many places. Like that, New York and parts of Italy were kind of the outliers as far as the number of deaths that occurred, and that it wasn't really repeated anywhere else. And so again, there are these kind of there are these things that happened that I think are tempting to those of us, sometimes inclined to kind of conspiratorial thinking, that like it's just really weird that this happened and there's not really any clear official explanation of it. And so, it's probably easiest to attribute it to some kind of centralized agency that wanted something out of this. I guess, even though I can understand the appeal of such an argument, I guess I tend to just see it as a much more emergent kind of horizontal process where various weird things happened that people didn't really understand, and the lack of understanding kind of exacerbated the fear. But going back to your question, which was about the left, I think the left, again, kind of picked up on this really a little bit late in the process, right? In fact, if you looked at least in the US, like what was the left concerned about? Well, they were concerned about like Trump saying the China virus would lead to hate crimes and things like that. And they were saying like, I'm proudly going to like eat at a Chinese restaurant tonight. to show I'm not afraid, right? And I think there was actually a pride in not being afraid initially, which is interesting, right? That it's like, well, this is just like a xenophobic panic, and so the initial framing actually worked against the fear narrative, right? Which is that it's a foreign threat, and the left has to be against xenophobia, and therefore has to stand up to this kind of fear narrative. So I think the point at which the fear narrative comes in is really when I really think it's hard to. There are various things that predispose the left to take the positions it did, but I think at least in the U.S., it was really Trump who kind of created a reaction by saying things like, well, we have to reopen the economy soon. And particularly the way he framed it, and several other kind of Republicans framed it as like, we need to save the economy, we need to reopen the economy, kind of gave the left this opening to say, well, look, they're prioritizing, money over human life. And so to kind of create that moral framing around it. Yeah. And then, I think the fear came in because the kind of I think the fear was actually something that came into the picture more once you could clearly frame kind of Trump and the right as the kind of laissez-faire camp in terms of COVID, because then at that point it becomes a kind of an extension of the fear narrative that's already built up around Trump as a fascist, authoritarian, figure.
Laissez-faire, moral control, and these sort of association. I mean, how much Jonathan Haidt, right, the moral psychologist, he has this term Safetyism, right, which he's kind of coined it. I personally think it's a great term, and I do see that sort of culture basically where safety is the highest moral value, right? So making sure everyone feels safe, is safe, and getting to your point about the left is sort of prioritizing the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable, and sort of this moral economy of vulnerability. Do you think that term, I mean, is that something that you explore, or some of your co-authors explore in the book as a lens of understanding what took place?
Oh, definitely. I would say that's, it's certainly a big way that I would think about this. And something that's striking to me about the safetyism and the sort of risk aversion is the way that the politics of that, I think, did kind of reverse, right? Where, again, going back to the war on terror era, which I, think of as kind of the era when my political sensibilities were formed. You had, I believe it was either Dick Cheney or Donald Rumsfeld who, promoted this idea of the 1% doctrine, which is basically that if there's 1% chance of like a terrorist attack happening on American soil, you have to treat it as 100% chance. And, so this would be a kind of political safetyism, right? Where you're and again, it's like terrorism was a huge part of the politics of fear for the right, really leading up until Donald Trump's election. And then interestingly, that too, I would say kind of pivoted because suddenly the threat of kind of white supremacist or whatever terrorism became a very prevalent one on the left. And again, I think fed into this kind of counter politics of fear where everything was about threats and dangers of these sorts, and this idea, and the dangers of, and then these other dangers, misinformation and so on. Right. And so, I think this kind of politics of risk aversion, of kind of taking, the slightest, if there's the slightest risk of something, it has to be treated as the maximal risk. Like this whole kind of principle of politics, again, I think goes back a ways, but it has a kind of, you have this concept of the risk society, I think, which was developed in the 90s. But so it kind of travels around politically, but I'd say certainly the left kind of embraces it at a certain point. And you can see that in the sudden interest in and desire to amplify narratives about terrorism, specifically about, sort of to make, like, anytime there's a mass shooting, to say that it's actually a political terrorist act. Like, this is a thing that started happening in the first Trump term. And to kind of connect this political narrative of fear and danger to, to these kind of rare mass casualty events. And
yeah. I like your mention about misinformation. I hadn't quite thought about it in that way of connecting risk aversion to the whole misinformation narrative. I mean, but it makes sense. Ideas are dangerous. They make you feel uncomfortable. There's these sort of risks. So hence we need to sanitize the information ecosystem. And so what do? We look to authorities, right? Getting back to the technocratic state concept. So yeah, I like that framing, because that's also been a kind of a perpetual thorn in a lot of people's side, is to try to understand the left's sort of pivot on appreciating the importance of freedom of speech and academic freedom and other things. So, okay, well, just to kind of wrap up the conversation here, I mean, do you think that that COVID represented this rupture, right, in terms of the political landscape, or do you think it just exasperated or sort of highlighted or exaggerated existing fault lines? What do you think is going to be the cultural kind of legacy, let's say, of the pandemic in your view?
So I would compare it to two prior events in my, adult life. The first being 9/11, the second being the 2008 crash. That these just seem like punctuation marks in the kind of historical unfolding of American politics, global politics, etc. And both of them have global ramifications. I mean, COVID really is a truly global event in the way that the few things have been, and obviously that's like in the name of your organization. But so that's an interesting part of it. But so I think it's a kind of again a kind of punctuation mark with the clear before and after.
Yeah.
But it's something that kind of shakes up the landscape, and then everything kind of resettles and things have kind of shuffled around. But it sometimes takes quite a while to figure out what is going to come of that. So that's why I guess at this point I don't necessarily want to make confident predictions. I mean, I think it did do some interesting things that I think we can already observe. One of which is that it seems to have kind of dealt a final blow to a certain type of I mean, so this also has to do with the left, right? And that's why I bring it up. So the left from roughly the 2008 crisis till 2020, the real enemy and the thing you were agitating against was austerity, was like the politics of austerity. Right. Certainly true in the UK, right? And I think the pandemic sort of by creating this moment of sort of massive,
right,
essentially across the board, like government bailouts of the economy, of individuals and so on, it really it seemed to like really bring an end to that moment of austerity. Now, that's not, I think austerity policies have come back in some ways. They're coming back in the UK under the Labour government. So they are going to come back. But nonetheless, I think, this notion of a kind of unified, like center left, center right sort of politics of neoliberal austerity as the main kind of antagonist of the left basically went away. And it's not clear quite what it's been replaced with. It's been replaced with a very confusing array of things. But nonetheless, I think it does kind of, it brings about the end of what seemed to be the kind of stable center of politics for a long time, and thus what the left kind of organized itself against. And so I think it's harder for the left to figure out what it's organizing itself against now.
Right. Does a term like neoliberal even make sense anymore? Does it have explanatory power at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think it it's at this point more useful as a kind of historical account of a certain modes of politics that arose at a certain time and seem to be, declining and gradually being replaced with something else, but it's hard to see what exactly that is. Now, I mean, when I say like I think the 2008 crisis, ultimately produces things like, Trump and the Brexit vote and so on. But it takes a long time to figure out, like it takes a long time for that to happen. And so again, I think it'll take some time to figure out what exactly the fallout of the sort of political and economic and so on fallout of the COVID moment will have been. So, but I do see it, if not as a rupture, at least as a kind of clear punctuation mark.
Yeah.
And, but it does also just, to me, leave a lot of questions unanswered, just because these policies were so, and, this is kind of, I assume what you spend a lot of time thinking about and discussing, but, these policies were so, kind of novel and, kind of not part of the playbook, experimental. And, so, and I think that's, if there's anything that's like not sufficiently understood by anybody, it's that, or by enough people, it's that, just that there was a kind of, scrapping of the pre-existing kind of policy playbook, and this new set of policies was rolled out, and then there's just been very little critical reflection on them on any large scale. I mean, there's been like kind of at the margins, like for example, in the US, you can now kind of permissibly talk about like school closures having been on the whole pretty bad. But so there are like certain things you can just bring up as like, this was not great, it went on too long, etc. But really questioning like on the fundamental level, I mean, these policies were abandoned. I don't necessarily see them being reintroduced for various kinds of contingent reasons, but there wasn't a really, and there just hasn't been a really robust sort of public discussion of where they came from and what happened.
I mean, that's what Collateral Global is all about. So I think that this is a good place to end. And I like your point about there being a lot of question marks about the cultural sort of implications that we're still sort of living in the mists, right, of this change, and which is sort of nameless almost in some ways. So thanks so much, Geoff, for the conversation. So that was Geoffrey Shullenberger, a cultural theorist and editor at Compact Magazine. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.